The United States just won a war against Spain and really set itself up to be a new world power. In the process, they got a bunch of new territories, including the Philippines. How did the Filipinos feel about that? That's what we're going to talk about today on Mr. E's Classroom. Hey ladies and gentlemen, Mr. E here. Today we're going to talk about a thing called the Filipino Insurrection. After the Spanish-American War, the United States gained the Philippines as a territory, and along with that, they also got a new group of people, the Filipinos. What was the relationship like between the United States and the Filipino people after the Spanish-American War? Pay attention to this video and you should be able to come up with an answer for that. So why exactly would the United States want to keep the Philippine Islands after the Spanish-American War? Three main reasons. Reason number one was to gain new trade in Asia. The Philippines gave us a prime location to be able to connect with other countries in Asia to try to sell the goods that we couldn't sell back home. Number two is to compete with European powers. It would help to prove the point that the United States was a world power, especially after beating Spain, who was really kind of on the decline as far as world power went. Beating Spain really wasn't as impressive as it sounded. And number three was to expand the U.S. influence in Asia. It really helped to extend the benefits of the American culture. From the Philippines, we could help spread the idea of how awesome it was to be an American. So why did we even have to deal with the Filipino insurrection? Why were the Filipino people so upset? Well, if you remember back when we talked about the Spanish-American War, that the whole point of that war was to free Cuba from the tyranny of Spanish rule. The Philippines were under that same rule. Many Filipinos, such as Emilio Aguinaldo, thought that the whole point of the United States going to war with Spain was to free all the Spanish territories from their rule. When it turns out after the Treaty of Paris was signed that the United States wasn't going to let the Filipinos govern themselves, Aguinaldo vowed to fight U.S. occupation. He said he would lead what was called a guerrilla war against these new tyrants, basically. So what is a guerrilla war? Well, it's really a non-traditional way of doing warfare. Back at the turn of the 20th century, we were still fighting most wars with the you line up on this side, I'll line up on this side, and we'll start shooting at each other until there's nobody left. Guerrilla warfare, on the other hand, relies on small bands of fighters that blend in. They look just like the people that you're trying to occupy. What they would do is they would pop out and surprise you with quick attacks, and then they would run off before you knew what was going on. Kind of the idea of run away and live to fight another day. And what really made guerrilla warfare difficult to deal with was the idea that you couldn't distinguish a guerrilla fighter from the regular population. So how did the United States deal with this new style of warfare we were encountering? Well, it really had its toll on the United States, especially the military. They weren't used to this kind of pop out and sucker punch attacks and then running away, or blending in with the non-combatants, the people not fighting. Really, the United States very quickly decided to jump straight to what were called extraordinary measures to try to crush the Filipino rebellion. If you look at this picture right here, you can kind of see an example of what an extraordinary measure would be. Today, we would call this waterboarding, and it would be extremely illegal. To give you an idea of just how much a toll this guerrilla war took on the United States, I want to read you a little bit of an excerpt from a San Francisco newspaper in 1902 at the very tail end of the Filipino insurrection. This is a direct quote from that paper, the San Francisco Argonaut. "Let us all be frank. We do not want the Filipinos. We do want the Philippines. All of our troubles in this annexation matter have been caused by the presence in the Philippine Islands of the Filipinos. The more of them we kill, the better. It may seem harsh, but they must yield to the superior race." Now again, this is directly from the San Francisco Argonaut in 1902. by 1902, we were kind of over this whole Filipinos trying to fight us with what we deemed to be very dishonorable tactics. By 1903, the United States military had pretty much put an end to the Filipino insurrection. We had kind of rounded up just about all the Filipino people that were still willing to fight this guerrilla war. What the United States decided to do was they would put these Filipinos that they rounded up that were kind of in rebellion against the U.S. rule, and they put them in what we would call special zones. Now, in a special zone, oftentimes you would see incredibly poor sanitation. There was a lack of enough food for everybody. And because people were in such cramped quarters, a lot of disease went rampant in these special zones. This is really interesting because we wound up doing the exact same thing to the Filipino people that got us so fired up against the Spanish in the Spanish-American War. Weren't the Spanish putting Cubans in special zones? Of course, they called their special zones concentration camps. The true cost of this Filipino insurrection was actually pretty high for the United States. Over the course of about 3 years, about 5,000 U.S. soldiers died. Now, this was really nothing compared to about the 200,000 Filipinos that wound up dying. The real cost, though, was monetary. It cost the U.S. about $400 million to conquer the Philippines. That's roughly about 20 times more than we paid the Spanish for the territory. Remember, we only paid about $20 million to get the territory from Spain. After the Philippine insurrection was more or less put down, after we had kind of conquered the Filipino people and kind of broke their will to fight U.S. occupation, the government put a guy named William H. Taft in charge. Taft loved being the governor of the Philippines. As the governor, Taft thought it would be a good idea to try to get the Filipino people back kind of on America's side. The way Taft did this, number one, was he censored the press. He basically said nobody can write anything bad about America in the newspapers. This went a really long way to kind of hush down any kind of possibility of an uprising. The second thing that Taft kind of went about doing was he built a lot of public projects, a lot of schools, a lot of roads and bridges, things that we would call infrastructure today, things that really helped to benefit the Filipino people, things they could actually go out and use. The third thing that Taft did, which was kind of a stroke of genius on his part, was he started to extend limited self-rule to the Filipinos. Basically, he appointed Emilio Aguinaldo and a few other higher-ups to basically govern the Filipino people. And anything they wanted to do, Taft was more or less okay with as long as they ran it by Taft himself. This really freed up Taft and let him kind of wander around the Philippines and just enjoy being there. The Filipinos kind of felt like they were governing themselves, even though Taft was really the man in charge. The United States did eventually pledge to give the Philippines their independence. In 1916, a thing called the Jones Act was passed. Basically, what the Jones Act said was that at some point in the near future, we will let the Filipinos have their own country. We will relinquish control of the territory and allow them to establish their own country. Unfortunately, this law passed right before World War I kind of got fired up. When World War I kind of got fired up, that sort of put a blanket on the Filipinos having their own independence. And after World War I, we had the Great Depression. And after that, we had World War II. So it kind of took a little while, but eventually on July 4th, 1946, the United States did relinquish control of the Philippines as a territory and allowed the Filipinos to establish their own government and country. So what were the consequences of U.S. imperialism in the Philippines? Well, the one big consequence was there was an incredible amount of tension between the United States and the rest of Asia there in the area. The U.S. had to work incredibly hard to maintain control of the Philippines as a territory and also maintain good relations with other Asian countries. It also kind of put a big giant target on America's back as far as other countries that kind of had imperial aspirations. I'm kind of pointing my finger at Japan there, because the Philippines would be one of the first major targets of the Japanese when they started to build an empire right before World War II started. What should you take away from this video? Well, number one is that the United States wanted imperial territory, and really they're not going to be deterred from that. Number two, the Filipinos really wanted independence and would really do whatever it took to get that. And number three, maintaining the Philippines as a territory was very costly for the United States. There you go, ladies and gentlemen, the Filipino Insurrection. Hopefully you got great notes and will be ready for a quiz when it happens in class. And as always, until next time, remember, guys, don't stop learning.